Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information and unearth the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight for you, tailor-made from your sources. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive. We're looking into a classic work that sits right at the intersection of anthropology and biblical studies, Sir James George Frazer's huge work, Folklore in the Old Testament. And specifically, we're zooming in on Part 3, Chapter 16. This chapter delves into something called the high places of Israel. And when we hear that phrase, high places, what should you typically picture? Are these just some obscure biblical references, or is there something, I don't know, deeper, more universal going on?
Well, that's exactly what makes Frazer's approach here so brilliant, and it's what we're going to unpack. He shows that practices often seen as uniquely Israelite, like, the later condemnation of these high places, actually tap into these profound, universal human ways of relating to nature, of making it sacred. It really shifts your understanding. It moves beyond just a theological story to a much more embedded cultural one. It shows how ancient Israel's religious customs might connect to much broader human experiences across different cultures. So our mission today is really to shed light on these surprising connections and contexts, giving you a shortcut to understanding a topic that's much richer than it might first seem.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Frazer paints quite a vivid picture of these ancient high places. What did they actually look like, and how did people, connect with the divine there centuries ago?
Frazer describes them as the standard, the customary places for religious worship, and almost always they were on natural high points, hills, mountains. You should picture these ancient hilltops, often shaded, maybe crowned, by really venerable trees with thick foliage. Things like oaks or terebinths were common. Importantly, these weren't like enclosed temples. They were mostly open to the sky, vastly open. Although sometimes they did have colorful canopies spread over them. But interestingly, not usually for the worshippers themselves, more to protect the key sacred emblems that were at the heart of the site. Typically a wooden pole, which is called the Asherah, and a standing stone pillar, the Maseba. It's quite a striking image, isn't it? Worship rooted right there in the landscape.
It really is.
And for ages, people gathered there. They offered sacrifices. And maybe surprisingly to us now, even figures we think of as pious, certain prophets, certain kings, they would lead devotions there. They genuinely believed they had divine approval.
That sounds almost idyllic in a way.
It does, yeah. There's a sense of a very organic, almost sort of primal connection between the land and the divine in that description.
Okay, so these places were once totally accepted, even central to worship, which makes it really fascinating then. How did they become such a major point of concern for the later Israelite prophets? What exactly changed? What was the turning point?
Yeah, that's really the core of Frazer's analysis in this chapter. He suggests that the very number of these sanctuaries, the fact that they were spread all across the land, actually encouraged a belief in many different deities. A corresponding multiplication, as he puts it. This started to blur the lines of, well, what we think of as early Israelite monotheism. So what might have started theoretically as worship of one god, maybe just in different local forms, began to kind of fray into a practical polytheism.
Practical polytheism, how so?
Well, think of it like this. Each one of these wooded hilltops started to be seen as the home of its own local Baal. Now, Baal just means lord or master. So these are basically local gods. People believed they handed out specific blessings, sunshine, rain, good crops, fertility for the flocks and the people, but just for their immediate area, their nearby hamlets. Frazer makes this really compelling comparison. A bit like how Italian villages historically looked to their local patron saints for help, these communities turned to their local Baalim. It was very localized, very tangible kind of divinity.
Ah, okay. So the prophet's concerns weren't purely theological then. Frazer seems to hint there was something more practical, maybe even existential, tied up in this.
Exactly. I mean, the theological alarm was definitely there. It ramped up into what the texts describe as fiery moral indignation, often focusing on what Frazer calls, based on those texts, lewd rites, sometimes linked with these fertility-focused cults. But Frazer argues these religious and ethical worries were significantly boosted, reinforced by political concerns.
Political concerns, so external pressures playing a role too? Geopolitics even? How did the wider world feed into this religious shift?
You've absolutely hit on a key point Frazer makes. He argues the prophets weren't just, ivory tower theologians. They were sharp political observers too. They understood that having a fragmented religious landscape with every high place dedicated to its own local Baal directly weakened the centralizing power the Israelite state was trying to build, especially when facing these huge rising empires like Assyria and Babylon. a religiously unified nation worshiping one God and one central place, specifically Jerusalem, that was seen as a kind of geopolitical necessity for survival, not just a spiritual preference.
Ah, so unity is strength, essentially.
Precisely. So their proposed fix was both religious and political. Sweep away all this high place worship, concentrate all religious ceremony in Jerusalem. The idea was that there, a more regular and solemn ritual could be controlled and enforced, which would hopefully ensure divine favor, but also national unity. That was the grand prophetic vision.
Right. And this is where Frazer points out something quite poignant, isn't it? Despite all the prophet's efforts, this grand plan to centralize and purify worship, well, it proved unavailing, as he puts it.
Exactly. The kingdom of Judah still fell. The
Yep.
people were still led captive to Babylon. Frazer uses this outcome to suggest just how deep-rooted, how persistent these older nature-based practices really were, which kind of brings us neatly to a crucial detail that keeps coming up: the trees.
Yes, the trees. That detail about green trees always being present at these high places, how central were they? Were they just, nice scenery?
Well, according to Frazer, based on the texts, they were much more than scenery. Our main information about these sites actually comes ironically from the prophets who were denouncing them. And those denunciations strongly suggest that green trees, especially evergreens it seems, were a defining characteristic. Not just incidental. You have Jeremiah, for instance, talking about altars and sacred poles right by the green trees upon the high hills. And Ezekiel gives this vivid picture of people offering sacrifices under every thick tree. And even Deuteronomy, the book of the law that later fueled King Josiah's big reforms, it gives these very specific, almost forceful commands. Destroy the worship places upon the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. And that destruction explicitly included smashing their altars and burning their Asherim, those sacred poles we mentioned. So clearly the trees were fundamentally tied to the practices being condemned.
Right. So not just a backdrop, but integral. And Frazer thinks there's a deeper historical, maybe even mythological reason for this connection.
That's his argument. He puts forward this really compelling idea, a conjecture he calls it. He suggests that these wooded hilltops, which remarkably you can still find remnants of even in modern Palestine, he thinks they might be the last surviving representatives of the old primeval forests. Yeah, the idea is that while human activity, farming, settlement, cleared the forests from the lowlands over centuries, superstition, maybe a fear of offending the spirits or gods living in the trees, let these small pockets, these scanty relics as he calls them, survive on the heights. And so these leftover groves, they then became the last retreat of the sylvan deities, the spirits of the woods. And that, for Frazer, is likely how sacred groves originated, not just in Israel, but in many cultures. It's this powerful idea that reverence for untouched nature, or maybe fear of it, is a fundamental driver behind these kinds of sacred spaces.
That really broadens the perspective, and this is where Frazer's comparative method really comes into its own right. He doesn't just look at Israel, he brings in examples from all over the world that seem to echo these ancient practices. What are some of the parallels he found?
Yes, this is where it gets really fascinating. He finds these striking similarities that suggest, maybe deep-seated human patterns, for instance. He talks about the Akikuyu in what was then British East Africa. They're farmers, much like ancient Israelites were, and they cleared huge areas of forest for their crops. But, crucially, they intentionally preserved certain tree-topped hills as sacred places. They actually feared getting sick or having bad luck if they disturbed these particular groves.
Okay.
And Frazer describes a specific ritual on a place called Kahumbu Hill. There, special priests, the Waziri, would sacrifice a sheep to their god Ngai, especially during droughts or famines. And really an amazing part, as Frazer relays it, is the reported outcome. Often thunder and rain would follow almost immediately. It's just a powerful echo of, say, the prophet Elijah's contest on Mount Carmel in the Bible. It shows the shared belief in direct divine power linked to specific natural spots.
That's incredible. Any others?
Oh, yes. Then there are the Mundas of Chotanagpur in Bengal, India. They don't make idols or images of their gods. Instead, they believe the gods live in special dedicated places called sarnas. And these sarnas are essentially protected patches of the original forest, untouched fragments. These groves are home to their village deities, like Dasali and Jar Era, who they believe are responsible for good harvests and who they pray to when people get sick. And Frazer draws a direct line here. He sees these local Dasalis as being very similar in function to the Baalim of Canaan, each god tied to its specific place in its well-being. Again, that link between local nature and local divine power.
Fascinating.
And then the Afghans. They have their ziyarats. These are holy shrines, often on mountaintops, and Frazer says they look strikingly like the descriptions of Israelite high places. These spots might be bare of fields, but they usually have some stunted trees. And people tie rags to these trees as symbols of vows they've made or prayers they've offered. These shrines are considered so sacred that if you leave personal belongings there, no one will touch them. And cutting wood from the trees around the shrine, that's seen as a serious sin.
So the trees are protected.
Exactly. Which often makes these ziggurats the only green spots left in landscapes that might otherwise be quite barren. Frazer connects these directly to the modern wellies, or saint shrines you still find in Palestine, which also often preserve sacred trees.
Right.
And one more quick one. The Cheremiss people in Russia. Frazer notes that even into modern times, they continued to use specific, isolated groves, they call them kitsoto, for sacrifices and prayers. Even if the rest of the countryside around them had been completely cleared of trees long ago, heights near streams, places that were once deep in forest, just remained sacred, preserving these ancient traditions.
So if you pull all these examples together, Africa, India, Afghanistan, Russia, what's the bigger picture Frazer is painting? What does it all mean?
Well, across completely different continents and cultures, you see these incredibly consistent patterns emerging, don't you? Sacred high places, carefully preserved trees or groves, local deities or spirits strongly tied to that specific piece of land, and rituals that connect people directly to the well-being of that land, fertility, rain, protection from sickness.
It does suggest a really fundamental human impulse, doesn't it?
It really does. For Frazer, these global parallels aren't just, interesting anthropological tidbits. They strongly suggest a deeply ingrained human tendency to see natural features, especially striking ones like hilltops and ancient prominent trees, as having spiritual power, as being sacred. So the practices in ancient Israel weren't some bizarre exception. They were actually part of this much wider, almost universal human tapestry of nature worship, animism, this belief that local gods controlled local blessings. And viewed through that lens, the Israelite prophetic movement becomes something even more radical. It wasn't just introducing monotheism. It was actively fighting against these incredibly deep-rooted, widespread forms of localized, nature-based religion.
That really does shift the perspective.
Okay,
Finally, let's loop back to one of those specific things found at the Israelite high places you mentioned right at the start, the Asherah. Now, this word often gets translated in English Bibles simply as grove, which you suggested could be misleading. Based on all these analogies, what was Frazer's insight into what the Asherah really was?
right. Bringing all those comparative threads together, Frazer makes a really persuasive argument here. He suggests that the Asherah, which seems to have been a standard, almost constant feature of these local high places, might simply have been the trunk of one of these sacred trees, but stripped of its branches. So it wasn't usually a grove in the sense of a whole group of trees. It was often a single prepared tree trunk, or maybe a carved wooden pole that stood for the sacred tree. Or perhaps even represented the female deity often associated with these sites, Asherah herself.
Okay. Not a grove, but a pole or prepared trunk.
Exactly. And he gives this fantastic analogy from the Kayans of Borneo to help visualize it. He describes how when they clear jungle to plant rice, they deliberately leave a few specific, often tall trees standing, especially on high points. Why? Because they want to avoid offending tree spirits they call toh, who they sort of vaguely believe use these trees as resting places.
Okay, that resonates with the sacred grove idea.
Yes, but here's the key part for the Asherah. Sometimes, these very trees they leave standing are stripped of most of their branches, maybe leaving just a tuft at the very top. Or sometimes they lash poles across the trunk and hang things like palm leaves or even bull roars, those old instruments that make a whirring sound from them. And Frazer says, look at that. This gives us a really vivid, almost like a photograph of how an Israelite Asherah might have looked and originated. A sacred, revered tree, sometimes deliberately shaped or stylized, standing there as a direct, tangible link to the spirits or deities of that place. It completely reframes the Asherah from just an abstract word grove into a very concrete, deeply symbolic ritual object.
What a deep dive that was. We've really journeyed, haven't we? From those ancient high places in Israel, out across the globe to sacred groves in Africa, India, Afghanistan, Russia, and back again. All seen through the really remarkable comparative perspective of Sir James George Frazer's folklore in the Old Testament, and specifically that key chapter, Part 3, Chapter 16.
Absolutely. And Frazer's work, especially this section we've discussed, it fundamentally helps us see that the religious world of ancient Israel was, well, far more tangled up with what we might call animistic beliefs, with a deep reverence for primeval forests, than the later texts sometimes let on. That struggle we read about between the push for monotheism and these persistent polytheistic tendencies, it wasn't just an abstract theological debate. It was deeply rooted in the actual land itself, in its ancient trees and its sacred hills. And it was a battle fought on political grounds just as much as religious ones.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of our own modern ideas about sacred spaces, or even just our feelings about the natural world, might still carry some faint echoes of these ancient, almost forgotten connections. Connections to those sylvan deities, as Frazer called them, and to the power of the land itself. Is a walk in a much-loved national park or revered old forest today still, maybe unconsciously, a little bit like a walk in an ancient high place? Something to think about, perhaps, until our next deep dive.